Tara, welcome to the first of the parallel sessions. Great speakers lined up for you. My name is Michael Boyle. I'm from the Queensland University of Technology. I'll be chairing this next couple of sessions and look forward to hearing from you. So don't be afraid. Get in. If you've got the app downloaded, you'll be able to ask a question via the app, and I'll try and keep an eye on that to make sure that you can get those, but also we'll get you to speak up as well. So to kick us off this morning, we've got a presentation from David Cameron from the University of Newcastle, Towards a Playable Archive, Transforming Storytelling Through Video Games and Drama. So it sounds very exciting. Just a little bit about David. David is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Learning and Teaching at the University of Newcastle. He's been doing that role for about 5 or 6 years. His research interest includes digital game-based learning, the use of everyday network media technologies in learning and teaching, and the application of applied drama convention techniques to produce engaged blended learning. So we just heard from John about the importance of engagement of students in learning and teaching. So really looking forward to hearing more from David about how that's been put into place at the University of Newcastle. So welcome, David.
Thank you. So it's it's a rather grand title, as one tends to do at conference presentations, but really there's one particular story that I'll be talking about transforming today. And that's the story of Beowulf. So Beowulf is the longest known Old English or Anglo-Saxon epic poem. And the text of the poem survives in a single medieval manuscript, probably copied down by some monks around the early 11th century, and it's now housed at the British Library in London. And the manuscript itself's in pretty rough condition. It was damaged by a fire in 1731, but it is often on display in the British Library, so you can go along and take a look at it. So the project I'll be telling you about today used digital game authoring software to create game levels devised from Beowulf, for use by students in schools and universities, and also by curators at the library, and also potentially by library visitors. And the project also used some activities like improvised drama and puppetry and media making as well to take a look at Beowulf. Who's familiar with the story of Beowulf? Does anyone, a few kind of know the tale? So Beowulf's a Geatish prince, and Geatland is in southern Sweden. And Beowulf takes a small band of warriors to Denmark to help a king, King Hrothgar, whose mead hall is being attacked by monsters. So it's a very noble tale. He goes to defend the pub from monsters. So, he's the first monster he encounters. Grendel is the first monster that he encounters, and like any good hero, he defeats Grendel. Much mead drinking ensues. But there's never just one monster, so he fights Grendel's mother with the addition of a wig. So, and again, he's victorious, great hero. 2 monsters is never enough. Why not fight a dragon? So Beowulf, when he's a much older man, encounters a dragon. He sort of wins this battle. He does kill the dragon, but the dragon kills him as well. The end. So that's kind of the basic story of Beowulf. Now, if you're not familiar with the story of Beowulf itself, you're probably familiar with some of the stories that emerge from it. And J.R.R. Tolkien was an Anglo-Saxon scholar who translated a version of Beowulf. So you can see it was very much on his mind when he would have been writing Lord of the Rings, and the settings and the heroes and the monsters from Beowulf appear throughout a lot of those fantasy stories that we're now quite familiar with in other forms through movies, TV, books, and video games as well. So that's the story of Beowulf. But really our understanding of Beowulf comes from this one physical archive in a cultural collection. Scholars have interpreted the text and translated it quite a bit of it is contestable and debatable about what it actually really means, and even what the story is really all about. And this is what Beowulf sitting there in the physical building that is the British Library is an example of what John Hartley would call the modern archive, and it's probably what we think most of when we talk about galleries and libraries and archives and museums. We think of physical buildings, often large institutional physical buildings, and of course the collection of objects that they house and curate. And often those collections are wonderfully curated for us to help us interpret what those physical artefacts mean in the bigger story of our culture and our lives. And increasingly, of course, these physical objects are presented in mediated forms as well. So Beowulf itself was one of the first big digitisation projects of the British Library. And we can look it up online and we can see high-resolution images of the original text, and we can read the text and search the text, and that's becoming fairly common, of course, with a lot of these physical archives that we have. Hartley also talks about what he called postmodern archives, and that's where we start to see things like mass media and television changing our engagement with archives and the physical objects in them. And we became not just visitors, but we became audiences for not just the physical real objects themselves, but for representations of the real. So we became quite used to engaging with history and culture through television and film and those kinds of things. So, it's kind of a shift away from having to go to those physical buildings to engage with some of these things. And increasingly, of course, we're engaging with what Hartley would call the networked archives. The internet itself being sort of the classic example of that. And he calls them probability archives because there's a whole bunch of stuff out there, but there's this kind of element of uncertainty depending on what search engine you use, what keywords you use, as to what might get thrown up when you start using these kinds of archives. And of course, the change in language tends to be, where we used to talk about visitors to spaces, where we used to talk about audiences for those mass media representations. Now we start to talk about users and co-creators in these kind of networked environments. So part of the project that I worked on became looking at things like, these are examples of networked archive. Even the British Library, is a kind of networked archive as well as being a physical archive because you can search its databases. The project I worked on was called the Playing Beowulf project. It was a digital transformations project of the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK. It was led by Professor Andrew Byrne at the Institute of Education in University College London. Had various partners like the British Library, some game design companies in the UK, and universities like University of Sydney and University of Newcastle in Australia. And the initial focus was to consider how video game design might be used to help students and curators, librarians, scholars, and us as library visitors or audiences or makers or users to engage with and explore and understand and reimagine Beowulf in a kind of modern context, using the tools that we're more familiar with now around digital creation and making. And it also extended into some other playful, play-based activities like improvised drama, puppet making, media making, and live performance as well. So I'll tell you a little bit about both of those aspects, the video game design aspect and the performative puppetry kind of aspect as well. So firstly to the game design software, and this is just to kind of walk through the basic process. It's called Mission Maker. It was designed quite a while ago at the London Knowledge Lab, University College London, and it's been kind of tweaked to suit this particular project of Beowulf. It runs in Unity. And this is kind of the basic game design interface because it was really important to engage people with the process of game design, not just play pre-built levels, but allow people to build their own levels as well. So this is an example of a pre-built level. It's incredibly well lit. There's lots of torches in this particular room. And you can see it's got the basic functionality that you would expect in these sort of typical games that are fairly common today. But the idea was to make it fairly quick. You can look in your backpack. Oh, nothing in there. Oh, you can go for a fight. Got a good right. But you'll see sort of how you just normally move through the level. It's a little bit jerky because of the frame rate. But all of these objects, these rooms, have been placed in there by someone building the level in the game design software. So they can create the map of the different rooms that they want, and they can position all the objects in there, and we'll get a bit of a sense of the kinds of things that are in there. when you're working with young people with this, about all you really need to show them is the password to get into the computer, and then they're off making all kinds of levels. So it's got all the kinds of features that people would probably expect to be able to build around a game. So you can put objects in there in this case. There's a map. Not much detail in it because it's just a demo level. I can put that in my backpack. And now when we have a look in the backpack, you can see the maps in there. So you can go along, you can set it up so that players have to collect levels and all those things, collect objects and use objects, collect weapons, all those kinds of things that you would expect in these sorts of game environments. And just to have a look at some of the game building elements within it. So it's based around this floor plan. There's a whole range of different prefabricated rooms in there. Because it's about the story of Beowulf, there's a whole bunch of things like the Mead Hall, underground caverns where Grendel's mother lived in the story and those kinds of things. So people can build up a world to run around in. You drag and drop different rooms into the map. That's how you build up the world. You can connect doorways, you can rotate shapes, you can delete rooms out of there. It's all fairly fast. Then you can go into your game world and you can move around. So you could go to a particular spot in the game. So in this case, I've added a kind of underground lair onto what was the pre-existing room in there. So I've just added a whole new kind of element on there. Got to jump over the furniture to get through. So this is the underground lair where the monster lives. So you can add in objects and characters. A lot of these are pre-built into there, so it's a little bit boring just walking around an empty room. And when people want to explore the story of Beowulf, they want to put in things like some of the monsters and other characters. So we can just drop a creature in. So this is a monster. So if we go into the world now, suddenly there's a monster in the world with us, but it's not really doing too much at this stage. So what you can do in Mission Maker is you can go in and the objects that you've added in there, you can start to edit them. So in this case, I can start adding attributes to that particular monster. So I can tell it to chase a player when it comes within a certain range. I can tell it to be more aggressive and to attack the player. And all of the characters that you drop in there have those kinds of attributes. A little bit confused at the moment, isn't quite sure where I've gone. Here I am. Hello. So it started to attack me. You can see my health started to go down. So you can program in these economies within the game, so you can set health and abilities and all those kinds of things. Yeah, see, give a bash. And the other thing you can do in Mission Maker, and this is quite interesting in terms of curricula now, where they've started to add coding into the school curricula. So you can start to build in like Boolean logic to things, so you can select objects and you can say, well, under certain conditions, this and that can happen. So this is where you really start to build the game elements. It's not just a case of wandering around in an environment and encountering things. So you can set things like traps, puzzles, doors that open and close depending on different attributes, magical objects that appear and disappear depending on certain conditions within the game. So you really can go in and start to build in rules and conditions that start to make it much more game-like as well. So this is the kind of gamey element of the project. As I said, there was also a live performance and media making kind of element as well. So this is part of the project that we did at Sydney University. It was a week-long workshop that we did in conjunction with Australian Theatre for Young People. ATYP often runs school holiday projects with young people where they go and do traditional theatre work. So they might go and work on play performances and directing and those kinds of things. We offered a workshop where they could come and do some of that, do some of the improvised performance, but also work with the game design software, work with large-scale puppetry, and also some media making. So we had about 18 young people. The age range was about 11 to 15, 7 girls and 11 boys, I think it was, and they came for a week-long workshop. And they worked with a whole range of people. They worked with an Anglo-Saxon scholar who explained what Beowulf was all about. They worked with puppeteers who showed them how to make puppets and how to work with those puppets in performance. They worked with more traditional theatre directors about how you improvise and put on live performance. And they worked with myself and some other media technician type people at the University of Sydney around building game levels and working in TV studios and radio studios to make different levels. So you can see, I mean, like literally within 5 seconds they'd build levels and they would just race through them, and they'd make up all kinds of interesting levels. So even though they were engaging with the story of Beowulf, they did just invent something like, oh, let's just create the biggest maze we can make and put a monster and treasure at the end of it, and then the aim of the game is to run through it and those kinds of things. So it's really fascinating to see, particularly what young people do when they're allowed to just kind of reinvent their games. They also recorded film clips and movies out of the game, which they then used within the live performance. So in the live performance, they wanted the mead hall, and so they actually captured image out of the game and turned that into video components for the live performance. So you can see they started to bring in the puppets into the game world using the kind of 3D game and the green screen. And I mean, the kids drove a lot of this themselves, and they didn't really need much direction or much guidance, maybe a bit of technical support. The live performance took place in what looked like an ancient mead hall. Like the University of Sydney's got a lot of old buildings, but it has the old assembly hall, which was fantastic. So they were able to go in there and they took the puppets in there. There's Beowulf ripping off Grendel's arm, a very important part of the process. And so live performance was very much a part of it as well, but they looked for ways, almost intuitive really, to incorporate what they'd been doing in the game with what they'd been doing with the puppets and the live performance. So they really brought the whole thing together. There's a dragon puppet. He's got a dragon. That's Grendel's mother. You can see that's the Grendel puppet with a wig. That's Grendel. That's how you turn Grendel into Grendel's mother. And then the parents came along, parents and friends came along and witnessed the live performance. And witnessing the live performance, of course, means recorded on their mobile phones. More dragon work. So there's Beowulf, Fashion and Dragon. Young Beowulf gets to walk off with Grendel's head at the end of the workshop. So that was one part of all that process. That gives you a pretty good sense, I think, of what was going on. So what did the participants think? Well, hey, it was fun, creative, kind of boring though. You can't win, can you? It's kind of like, oh, it was awesome, but meh. No, they. I think that's it, But they loved it. They thought it was quite fantastic. Interestingly, we asked the participants in that workshop to describe, if you had to describe it to a friend, what did you do during the week? And it's like, well, we took a whole bunch of different things, and we mashed it all up into one big performance, and the different media forms complemented each other, and it was pretty fun. But be prepared to work hard. Maybe that's why it was a bit boring. Sometimes it was hard work as well. But I think we forget that hard work can be fun. Now, the interesting thing about this is when we start to think about, well, what does it mean? in terms of something a little bit more theoretical, we see a connection between, this young person's perspective on what they were doing and things that are emerging from performance studies, particularly around, intermediality, which Child Cattenbelt sort of, kind of sums up. It's a complex system, really. When you start to look at different forms of media that can exist in a space, real and virtual at the same time, you're not just seeing all these individual media forms. It's this complex systems thing where something else emerges from that is probably more powerful than the constituent parts, and you start to see this kind of mutual effect. So what the participants were describing as, we took all these different things and mashed them up. You can see that it's starting to create this kind of fluid movement in and out and between different modes and media, and together they create new spaces that mix the physical and the virtual together. And we were interested in how that allows us to tell new stories, certainly, but also reimagine old stories in new ways. And so that was one of the aims of the project. So we started to think about, what Hartley had called the modern archive and the networked archive and the postmodern archive. And we've sort of played around with the term playable archives as an attempt to capture that sense of performance is very much a part of this, play is very much a part of this, capturing and sharing and remixing and redistributing is very much a part of this. And you're seeing examples of some institutions that are becoming more playful with their collections. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, an example of this in one way, where they've put all of those masterpieces online in a digital form, and you can go and do all kinds of things to them, print them out on mugs and T-shirts. Rembrandt wouldn't mind. Start to remix those things, but more importantly, share them. So you can make something new out of the existing archive, do something different with it, and then share it back into the archive. So in a way, users are engaging more and more with those archives in their own creative way, and then that new content is becoming part of the archive as well. And as I said, we're trying to find ways now, or having to find ways of how do we start to account for and incorporate the personal archives that we're all creating. All of our thumb drives, all of our hard drives, all of our phones are now full of our own kind of original content and content that we're capturing and sharing. So you see it here with the families all had their phones out. They were posting on Facebook, sharing them to family and friends that weren't there. People were live broadcasting it on Periscope, on Twitter. And in a sense, how do we capture that, mix that, remix that with our institutional archives and create something new as well? So really, we're starting to think about the playable archives as being this combination of the as-is and the as-if, which is a very kind of drama-ly approach to it as well. That sense of being able to hold the real world in our heads at the same time as we start to hold the imaginary worlds that we're capable of creating and generating. So this really is sort of the kind of summary of it, really, is this as-is, as-if approach now to archives. How do we let people blend the real, the physical objects in our archives with what they want to do with them creatively and in terms of imagination, capture that and redistribute that in kind of interesting ways. And so that was certainly one of the outputs of that project. In terms of following up more on what was done and how it's extending out into other projects, DARE that's the sort of unit within the London Knowledge Lab at UCL that drove the project, and certainly that blog is full of lots of background to the project, lots of video clips, lots of information about who was involved and the different aspects of how it came together, and certainly what the findings were. This isn't kind of meant to be a plug for my book. There is a chapter on this project in the book. It's due to be released in a couple of months. Don't buy it, because it's really going to be really expensive, as is the way of academic books. Get your library to buy it, or I hope to put some of the chapters, the pre-press versions of the chapters up online, probably, somewhere so people can access them. So feel free to get in touch if you're interested. So that's where you can find some more information about the project. That's kind of it, really. Thanks.
I've got one, if you don't mind. So, the connection between all the different elements of that. So, guess if I remember back to when I was young, we might have watched the politically incorrect as it was, the Cowboys and Indians on TV. Then we would have gone out in the backyard and played Cowboys and Indians, but we didn't have the digital connection.
Yeah.
But I see now a lot of kids playing things like the Minecraft and that, but I don't necessarily go and see them go out in the park and playing Minecraft.
No.
So bringing all the different elements together, the digital and the actual active elements, that's important to have all those elements in play.
Yeah, and well, I think, a whole other aspect of this project that emerged, even with the game design software, was just how much, when you start working with particularly young people, but not just the younger people that were doing it, how much they wanted to get, when they were talking about designing a level, and you see a lot of it here of pictures of people sitting in front of a screen, engrossed in the screen. But inevitably they'd kind of stand up and they'd want to act out what they were going to design, and there's this very much this sense of embodiment still, even when people are designing these types of games. And I think particularly because it was a 3D world that they were kind of designing from the top down and then going into, they very much, the real world would come into it. And that thing about playground play, like Andrew Byrne, the guy at Dare, has done research into the games that kids play in school playgrounds and tracking just that, like how games like Call of Duty and Skyrim, like all those big Xbox games and things, how the language from those is now infiltrating into their physical play. So they might still be hanging off the monkey bars and whatever, but then suddenly it'll be like, now let's go to level 3, yeah, quick, fight the boss monster or whatever. So the language has sort of shifted, but it still sort of comes into the physical play. So you're sort of seeing this back and forth, and I think that's part of the intermediality. Like, it's not all about the digital technology. The body is still really important, and I think we're still starting to recognise how it's the interplay between the physical world, including us as embodied brains, and the digital, and how that actually lets you do more. If you think about just the digital, it kind of narrows off the physical stuff that you can do, which I guess is why we're kind of really interested in augmented reality and virtual reality as well, because it brings back the body. So it's not just about the screen. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I guess it's that thing, and it's no mean feat to create game design software around Beowulf. Like, but they had Mission Maker that existed as a kind of more generic thing, and then they've had to redesign it specifically for this project. So the idea of saying, oh well, let's pick another object and create a game around that, it does take a lot of resources to do it. But I think what a lot of institutions are doing is trying to say, well, we don't have to build that software. What's already out there now as everyday software that lends itself to those things? And so it is a case of saying, well, what design packages are people making now to help people make augmented reality games? We don't have to design that, but you can take that off the shelf and adapt it to your setting to allow for different types of objects in there. I'm not quite sure I'm answering your question, but I think I would say, yeah, like it's all very well to get funding specifically around let's look at Beowulf, let's get the library involved, let's make game design software, but you can't go and do that for every object that you have in your collection. So there is a challenge there around scaling it up to suit. Does it kind of get to it? Yeah. Yeah, well, again, at UCL, this project led to some connections into some of their big data specialists who kind of went, hey, right, and because what they saw was the Anglo-Saxon scholars get engaged with this, like people who are used to sitting in rooms with dusty books, speaking Old English, were absolutely fascinated with the power of the game to engage their students, university students, with those things. And so I think the nerds, the super data nerds, kind of went, well, if you can engage the Anglo-Saxon scholars, what can we do with data that might engage our students and people working with us around that. And they've gone on to do some other projects now that are starting to bear fruit. So, because I think what it does is it sort of opens your eyes to say, well, yeah, we're not making a Beowulf game. We're making a platform for people to re-examine Beowulf by making games, or we're making a platform for people to re-examine data around this data set. And so that, yeah, they are exploring that. It has led to other research, not just about literature and stories, but around data and archives. So it's interesting.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure David will be able to hang around now and ask more questions if you've got them. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you. Thanks. Chocolate.